Clara Whitmore stepped into that auction yard with $3, a broken heart, and nothing left to lose. The man on the platform had chains on his wrists and a bruise across his jaw. Laughed. She didn't. She raised her hand and bought him. If you've ever been told you were worth nothing, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1882 came to Black Pine Valley like a punishment. The sun cracked the earth wide open. The creek behind the Whitmore ranch had dropped so low that Clara could walk across it in her boots without wetting her ankles. The vegetable garden she'd planted in April was more dead than alive. Half her fence line had collapsed after the late spring winds, and 2 of her horses had come up lame in the same week. She had $37 to her name. The banknote on her property was due in 60 days. And her ranch hand, old Pete Granger, had quit without warning 3 mornings ago. Left a note on the table that said only, "Too much work, Ned. Not enough hope." Clara. She hadn't cried over it. She didn't have the water to spare. She pulled on her boots before dawn that Thursday morning, fed the horses that could still walk, hauled water from the creek in 2 buckets, then sat at her kitchen table, with her ledger open in front of her. She'd been sitting with that ledger every morning for 2 months. The numbers never changed in her favor. She was 29 years old, a widow for 14 months, and she was running out of time in every direction she looked. The auction in town wasn't something she'd planned to attend. She heard about it from the Miller girl, who came riding past the ranch gate just after sunup, hollering something about a wild man they'd brought down from the mountains. They're selling him, Miss Clara, the girl called out, breathless and wide-eyed. Right there in the square. You ought to come see. Clara had no interest in spectacle. She had fence posts to set and water to haul, but she needed a ranch hand. That was the simple truth of it. She needed someone who could work. Someone strong. Someone who wouldn't quit after 2 weeks when the labor got hard. She had no money to pay a proper wage, not $60 a month like the larger ranches offered, and every able-bodied man within 20 miles either already had employment or had made it plain they wouldn't work for a woman alone. She told herself that was the only reason she hitched up the wagon and drove into Black Pine Valley that morning. She told herself it was purely practical. She smelled the auction before she saw it. Sweat and livestock and unwashed wool and the sharp bite of whiskey already opened before 9 in the morning. The square in front of the Black Pine General Store was packed with men, maybe 60 or 70 of them, and shoulder to shoulder, some up on the rail fence, some standing on wagon beds to get a better view. Clara tied off her horse at the far post and made her way through the edge of the crowd. She heard the laughter before she saw what they were laughing at. It was not kind laughter. It was the kind of laughter that came from a crowd that had decided someone was beneath them and wanted that person to know it. She pushed past 2 men in canvas jackets, stepped around a woman with a market basket who was watching with her mouth pressed tight and disapproving, and then she saw the platform. He was already standing on it. Elias Hawthorne. She didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later. In that first moment, she knew only what she saw, and what she saw stopped her completely. Enormous, 6'4" at least, maybe taller. Broad through the shoulders, in a way that didn't look like vanity, it looked like years of work, years of hauling and building and surviving alone at altitude, where the air itself pushed back at you. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder. His jaw was dark with a bruise that was still fresh, still purple at the center, where the bone sat close under the skin. He had iron cuffs on both wrists, a short chain between them, and the chain was attached to a bolt ring set into the top of the platform post. He was chained to the post like livestock, and he was standing absolutely still. Not cowering, not straining against the chain, not looking at the crowd with anger or fear or pleading. Just standing. His eyes were somewhere beyond the crowd. Beyond the rooftops. Somewhere up toward the mountain ridgeline that rose behind the town to the north, blue and distant in the summer haze. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Culliver, who ran the livery stable and considered himself a wit, was working the crowd with the enthusiasm of a man who'd never had a better morning in his professional life. Now, gentlemen and ladies, if they're any brave enough, he paused for the laugh. He got it. We have here before you the one, the only, the infamous mountain wolf of Black Pine County. Elias Hawthorne, brought down from his den just 3 days ago after he trespassed across Harlan Briggs's north pasture and refused to move along peaceable. Refused? Someone in the crowd called out. I heard he threw Briggs's foreman through a fence rail. The crowd roared. The auctioneer raised both hands. There may have been a disagreement of some minor physical nature, yes. But the point is, gentlemen, this man is able-bodied, he is available, and Judge Colton has seen fit in lieu of fine payment, which Mr. Hawthorne could not produce, to offer 60 days of his labor at auction to cover the debt. What we have before us today is 60 days of mountain-hardened labor at whatever price this fine community sees fit. What's he good for besides breaking fences? Another man yelled. I wouldn't let him near my horses. I wouldn't let him near my wife. After, harder this time and meaner. Clara watched the man on the platform. He didn't react to any of it. Not to the jokes, not to the insults. Not to the laughter that washed over him in waves. He stood, with his shoulders back and his chin level and his eyes fixed somewhere far away, and something about that stillness, that absolute, deliberate stillness, made Clara's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She knew what it looked like when someone had made the decision to endure. She'd seen it in the mirror. Starting bid at $10, Culliver called. Who'll give me $10 for 60 days of the mountain wolf? Silence. Real silence. The laughing crowd went quiet all at once, because this was money now. This was real, and nobody wanted the liability of that man on their property. Dollars. Somebody give me 10. Nothing. All right, $5. $5 for 60 days. Still nothing. Clara watched the man on the platform. She watched the line of his jaw. She watched his hands, those enormous, scarred hands hanging between the chain, and she noticed that his fingers were not fisted. Not rigid with anger. Just open, like a man who had stopped expecting anything and had made peace with that. Nah. $3. Nah. Culliver said, and the amusement in his voice had started to curdle into something else, something impatient and dismissive. $3 for 60 days' labor. Surely somebody, it's a bargain. For heaven's sake, the man's built like a... Clara raised her hand. The silence that followed was so complete that she heard a horse stamp its foot somewhere on the far side of the square. Then the crowd turned to look at her, and the noise that came up from 60 men and a dozen women was not laughter anymore. It was something between disbelief and outrage, with a thread of something uglier running underneath. Yeah, Clara Whitmore, a man directly to her left, a neighbor named Dodd, looking at her like she'd just announced she intended to jump off the church roof. You have lost your mind entirely. I have not, she said. I have lost $3. She kept her hand in the air and her eyes on Culliver. The auctioneer blinked at her. Then he looked at the crowd. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who genuinely did not know what to do next. Ma'am, he said carefully, you do understand what you're bidding on. I understand exactly what I'm bidding on, Clara said. 60 days of labor. That's what you advertised. This is Elias Hawthorne. I can see that. He is not. Culliver seemed to be searching for the diplomatic construction. He is not accustomed to working in a domestic arrangement. He is a mountain man. He is rough. He is standing right there, Clara said, and I expect he can hear every word you're saying about him. That produced a different kind of quiet. She looked at the man on the platform then, directly at him, not past him the way the rest of the crowd was doing, not through him, as though he were a post or a fence rail. Nay, she looked at him the way she would look at any person she was speaking to. His eyes moved from the mountain ridgeline. They found her face. And for one moment, one single held moment, the absolute blankness of his expression cracked open just slightly, just enough to show something underneath that she could not name yet, but that she recognized the shape of. "Do you have any objection to ranch work?" she asked him, direct as morning. The crowd made a collective sound of pure astonishment. Culliver stared at her. The man on the platform, Elias Hawthorne, looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. "Nan." Then he said, in a voice that was low and rough and barely loud enough to carry, "No, ma'am." "Good," Clara said. She looked back at Culliver. $3, she said. "Do I have it or not?" Culliver brought the hammer down before anyone could think of a reason to stop him. Getting him off the platform took longer than the auction itself. Culliver fumbled with the key ring. The chain came free. Elias Hawthorne stepped off the platform, without assistance and without looking at the crowd, which had gone from stunned to loudly and aggressively opinionated in the space of about 45 seconds. "You're making a mistake, Clara. He'll burn your barn down. He put a man through a fence. You remember that. You're a widow on a failing ranch, not a charity house." Clara walked to her wagon through the crowd and did not respond to any of it. She heard Elias Hawthorne's boots on the packed earth, behind her heavy, measured, not hurrying. She didn't look back. She reached the wagon and turned. He was standing 3 feet behind her, the chain still hanging from his left wrist cuff, because Culliver hadn't gotten around to removing the iron itself, just the bolt. The arms were at his sides. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, not suspicious exactly, but watchful. A man cataloging exits. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "I run the Whitmore Ranch on the north slope, up against the first ridgeline. It's about 4 miles out." He said nothing. "I need the fence line reset, the south pasture ditch cleared, the barn roof shored up before fall, and whatever else can be managed in 60 days with 2 functioning adults and 2 lame horses." "No, still nothing. The pay that was promised by the court arrangement will go to your debt. I can't offer anything on top of that, but you'll have food and a dry place to sleep, and I will not treat you like—" She paused. Chose her words. "Like what they just did up there." Silence stretched. Then Elias Hawthorne said, "You got a hammer?" Blinked. "For the fence posts," he said. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. "Yes," she said. "I've got a hammer." "Then I reckon we can start on the fence line," he said. Walked around to the back of the wagon and climbed in without being invited, folded himself down to sit against the side rail, and fixed his eyes back on the mountain ridgeline. Clara climbed up to the driver's bench. She could feel the eyes of the entire town on her back as she clicked the horse forward and drove out of the square. She did not look back at Black Pine Valley, neither did he. The 4 miles to the Whitmore Ranch were accomplished without a single word. Clara drove. Elias sat in the back. The summer heat pressed down on the road like a hand, and the dust rose in soft plumes behind the wheels, and the mountains to the north grew slowly larger and more present as they left town behind. Clara was not afraid of silence. She'd lived with it for 14 months. But she was aware of him the way you were aware of a storm moving in from the west, not in a threatening way. Precisely, but with the constant, low-level attention that large and unpredictable things demanded. When they reached the gate of the ranch, she pulled up and set the brake and climbed down to open it herself, the way she always did, because there was no one else to do it. She heard him drop to the ground behind her before she'd finished with the latch. He reached past her, not pushing her aside, just reaching and lifted the gate off the ground an inch, taking the weight of the thasking iron off the hinge, so the latch came free cleanly. She hadn't asked him to do that. She hadn't known he'd noticed the gate was dragging. She swung it open. He held the weight of it until she had it all the way open, then stepped back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. She drove the wagon through. Walked behind. She showed him the barn first, the loft where he could sleep, the water barrel at the side, the hook on the post where she kept the lantern. The barn was not fine accommodation, but it was dry, and the roof only leaked in one corner that she'd already blocked off with a piece of canvas. Elias walked the perimeter of the barn the way a man walks property. He is calculating, measuring with his eyes, noting the weak points, reading the structure the way some men read words on a page. Post on the south end is rotting out, he said. No, if you don't get that replaced before the first snow, the whole wall's going to lean. I know that too, Clara said. That's why I need someone who can work. He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was something in his face, not softening exactly, but a recalibration. Like he had expected a different response and was adjusting his assert. Culliver left the iron on, she said, nodding at the cuff on his wrist. I'll get the file. Don't bother, he said. It can't be comfortable. Ain't the worst thing I've worn. She almost asked what was. She stopped herself. She brought him a plate of food, instead cold cornbread, and the last of the salt pork and 2 tomatoes from the garden that weren't entirely gone yet. She left it on the fence rail outside the barn and went back to the house. Nay. When she came back an hour later with the water bucket, the plate was empty, and he was already working. He had found the post-hole digger in the tool shed without being told where it was. He was halfway up the south fence line, working in the full weight of the afternoon sun without his vest. Muscles of his back and shoulders moving with the efficient force that came from a man who had been doing physical labor all his life and had long since stopped thinking about it. He hadn't asked her which posts needed replacing. He'd just walked the line and figured it out himself. Clara stood at the fence line and watched him for a moment. Then she picked up the other end of the fence staple kit and went to work on the section closest to the gate. They worked separately and without conversation until the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the air began to cool. When Clara straightened and stretched the ache from her lower back, she counted the posts that had been reset. Posts in one afternoon. She hadn't managed more than 2 alone in a full day. She put the tools in the shed. She went inside and made supper beans and biscuits and the end of the coffee, and she brought a portion out to the barn and left it outside the door. She did not knock, she did not call his name. She just left it and went inside. She sat at the ledger table in the dark for a while, looking at numbers, and she thought about what she had done that morning in the town square. She thought about the way Culliver had looked at her, and the things the crowd had said, and the way Dodd had looked at her, like she was a woman in the process of making the worst mistake of her already unfortunate life. She thought about the man on the platform, and his hands hanging open, and his eyes fixed on somewhere far away. She thought, he's not what they said he was. Then she thought, but you don't actually know that yet, Clara. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. By the end of the 3rd day, she knew 3 things about Elias Hawthorne. First, he worked without stopping and without complaint. Not the frantic, prove-yourself working of a man trying to make an impression, but the steady, unrelenting working of someone for whom effort was simply the natural state of existence. He rose before she did. She knew this because when she came out at first light the second morning, half the water barrel was already transferred to the horse's trough, and the tool shed door was standing open. Second, he did not ask for anything, not extra food, though he was clearly burning far more than she was giving him. Not better accommodation, not explanation, not gratitude, not acknowledgement. He took what was offered and used it well and required nothing beyond that. Third, he was watching her the way she was watching him. Not with suspicion, not with calculation, with the careful sideways attention of someone who has been wrong about people before and is trying to read the situation correctly this time. She caught him doing it on the afternoon of the 3rd day. She'd come around the corner of the barn with a pail of water for the garden, and he was standing at the fence line 20 feet away, and he didn't quite manage to look away fast enough. And say anything. He didn't say anything. She kept walking. But after that there was something different in the air between them. Not warmer exactly, but more honest, like 2 people who had acknowledged, without words, that they were both paying attention and had decided that was all right. On the 4th morning, she was on the roof. There was a section of shingles on the east side of the house that she'd been meaning to address since March, and the summer thunderstorm season was coming, and she had no intention of sleeping under a leaking roof again, if she could prevent it. She'd gotten the ladder propped and climbed up with a pry bar and a bundle of cedar shingles, and was working on the worst section when she heard his boots on the rungs behind her. She did not ask him to come up. She also did not tell him to go away. He came up over the eave and crouched beside her, and looked at the damage with the same eyes first, measuring assessment he gave to everything on the ranch. "You're pulling those out wrong," he said. "I'm pulling them out," she said. "You're splitting the ones underneath. Use the flat end, not the curved." She stopped. She looked at the pry bar. She turned it around. She continued. "Better," he said. He held the new shingles in place while she nailed them down. They worked across the damaged section without talking about anything except the work that one's not seated right. Try the next nail over, that one's good, and by the time they climbed down, the east slope of the roof was solid for the first time in 2 years. "You done any roofing before?" she asked. "Done most things before," he said. "Where'd you learn a beat of quiet?" "My father," he said. She didn't ask about the before, but she filed it away. On the 5th day, a man rode onto the property uninvited. He came up the south road at a good pace, a man in a good coat on a well-kept horse, and he pulled up at the gate and called for her without dismounting. Miss Whitmore, Gideon Marsh, representing the First Territorial Bank of Black Pine County. Clara came out onto the porch. "Mr. Marsh, you can come back in 60 days when the note is due." "I'm afraid we can't extend that courtesy," Marsh said pleasantly. He had the smile of a man who had practiced being pleasant while delivering bad news and considered himself very skilled at it. "The bank has reviewed your account and determined that given the current condition of the property, we have concerns about the viability of your operation going forward. We'd like to discuss an early renegotiation of the terms." "Terms say 60 days, Clara said. "I'll have your money in 60 days. Miss Whitmore, with respect, we have had this property assessed, and you had it assessed," she said it flat. "When? Last month." "A representative rode the property. Without my knowledge." "It's in the loan agreement. Clause 14. The bank reserves the right." "Know what Clause 14 says." She came down off the porch one step. "What I'm asking is why you had it assessed now, when the note doesn't come due until the end of summer." Marsh's pleasant smile held firm, but something shifted behind it. "It's standard practice." "It is not standard practice," Clara said. "I have had this note for 3 years, and in 3 years nobody has ridden this property without my invitation. So I'll ask you again, Mr. Marsh, why now?" Behind her she heard the barn door. She did not look back, but she heard his boots on the packed earth. Heard them come to a stop somewhere behind her right shoulder. Marsh's eyes moved past her. The pleasant smile flickered. Daddy started. "That is my ranch hand," Clara said. Marsh was quiet for a moment. His horse sidestepped. Brought it back under control, with more effort than a man on a calm horse should need. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice had changed, still pleasant, but with an edge under it now. "I want to be direct with you. There are parties who have expressed interest in acquiring this property for development. Good parties, legitimate parties. The bank believes the fairest outcome for everyone involved would be—" "The fairest outcome for everyone involved," Clara said, "would be me keeping my property and paying back my loan, which is what I intend to do." "Miss Whitmore, you have a good day, Mr. Marsh." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the figure behind her one more time, and something in his calculation shifted, and he pulled the horse around without another word and rode back down the south road. Clara stood on the porch step and watched him go. She heard Elias Hawthorne behind her. She heard him not move, just standing there at her back, saying nothing. She didn't turn around right away. When she did, he was looking after Marsh with the same distant expression he gave to most things. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. "Him?" she asked. "No, his kind," Elias said. She looked at him. "You think he'll come back?" she said. It was not quite a question. I think Elias said slowly that men who ride onto someone's property to tell them they're losing it don't usually stop after one visit. Clara looked down the south road, where Marsh had gone. Then she looked at the fence line that was now solid and true. At the barn roof that wasn't leaking. At the garden that was still dying in the heat but hadn't given up yet. Then we better make sure everything's in order before he does, she said. Elias Hawthorne looked at her, Nan. Then he said, me, very quietly, as if the words cost him something, yes ma'am. Went back to the fence line. She went back inside to the ledger. And the numbers, for the first time in months, did not look entirely hopeless. Gideon Marsh came back on the 7th day. He didn't come alone this time. He brought 2 men with him, big men, the kind hired not for paperwork, but for presents, and he rode up to the gate at mid-morning with the easy confidence of someone who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horses. She straightened up, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked around to the front of the house without hurrying. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying toward trouble only told trouble it had power over you. Marsh dismounted at the gate. His 2 men stayed on their horses. Miss Whitmore, he said, pleasant as ever. I hope this morning finds you well. It was finding me fine until just now, Clara said. Something moved at the corner of her vision. Elias had come out of the barn. He didn't walk toward them. He just came out and stood at the barn door, his arms at his sides, watching. Marsh's eyes found him, held on him for a moment, then came back to Clara. I'll be direct, Marsh said. The bank has moved up its timeline. We're prepared to offer you a settlement fair market value for the property as assessed, minus your outstanding debt. You'd walk away clean, no further obligation. I'd walk away without my ranch, Clara said. Miss Whitmore, my husband built this ranch, Clara said. He broke ground on this property 8 years ago. He hauled every stone of that foundation himself. He died on this land. She kept her voice level. I am not walking away from it. Your husband is gone, Marsh said, and there was just enough gentleness in his voice to make it condescending. And you are a woman alone, the practical reality. The practical reality, Clara said, is that my note doesn't come due for 53 more days. And I will have your money in 53 days. So whatever timeline the bank has moved up, it can move right back. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias again. Then he said, the men your husband borrowed against, they're not patient men, Miss Whitmore. The bank doesn't always control its own timeline. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The threat was so smoothly packaged that it almost didn't sound like one. Almost. I understand you perfectly, Clara said, and I want you to understand me. This is my property. You are standing at the edge of it. And I'd like you to ride back the way you came. One of the mounted men laughed a short, contemptuous sound. Elias Hawthorne was no longer standing at the barn door. He was standing 10 feet behind Clara, and he had moved there so quietly that even she hadn't heard him come. The laughing man stopped laughing. Marsh looked at Elias with the expression of a man recalculating odds. His pleasant smile had thinned out considerably. We'll be back, Miss Whitmore, he said. I expect you will, she said. Good day, Mr. Marsh. He mounted up. He and his men rode back down the south road, and this time they went faster than they'd come. Clara stood at the gate until the sound of hooves faded entirely. Then she let out a long, slow breath. Men like that don't give up that easy, Elias said from behind her. No, Clara agreed. They don't. You got anyone in town who'd stand up for you? Lawyer, judge? Judge Colton's the one who sent you to auction, Clara said. And the only lawyer within 40 miles is Herbert Gaines, who has been on a retainer with the First Territorial Bank for 6 years. Elias was quiet for a moment. So you got nobody, he said. I've got 53 days and $37, she said. And I've got fence posts that aren't going to set themselves. She turned away from the gate. So I suggest we get back to work. She heard him follow her. He didn't say anything else about it. But that night, sitting at the ledger table, She wrote down Gideon Marsh's name at the top of a clean page and underlined it twice. Beneath it she wrote, "Men behind him who, and beneath that, what is on this land that they want." She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the book and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the summer wind work its way through the eaves, and she thought about the way Marsh had said, "The men your husband borrowed against not the bank, not the institution." Men. Specific men. Men with a timeline. Her husband James had borrowed the original sum from the First Territorial Bank 3 years ago. That was a straightforward transaction. She had the paperwork. But James had also done other business in his last year. Business he hadn't always discussed with her in full. Business she had assumed was simply the ordinary complexity of running a ranch in a territory that was still finding its shape. She had not looked at his papers in 14 months. She got up. She went to the cedar chest under the window, where James's papers were stored, and she opened it, and she started reading. She was still reading at 3 in the morning when the lamp oil ran low. She found it on the 4th page of a folded letter, written in a hand she didn't recognize. The letter was dated 13 months ago, 1 month before James died. It referenced an agreement between James Whitmore and a party identified only as GHM Acquisition for the mineral survey rights to the north slope of the Whitmore property, extending from the tree line to the ridge. The rights had been sold for a sum of $200, which James had apparently used to cover a shortfall in the ranch's operating expenses. The rights were valid for 3 years from the date of signing. $200 for 3 years of mineral survey access to the north slope. Clara sat very still with the letter in her hands. She thought about what was on the north slope. She thought about the old survey markers her husband had mentioned once, casually, as if they weren't significant stakes that some company had put in along the upper ridge, he'd said. Probably nothing. She thought about the creek that ran down from the ridge and through the property. She thought about the mining operations that had been expanding steadily across Black Pine County for the past 4 years, chewing into the mountain in every direction that showed the right kind of rock. Thought about Gideon Marsh and his pleasant smile, and the way he'd said the men your husband borrowed against with that careful, deliberate gentleness. GHM, Gideon H. Marsh. And then she understood exactly what she was sitting in the middle of. Her husband had signed away mineral rights to a man who was now also her banker. A man who had set up the original loan, knowing he would eventually control both the debt and the rights to whatever was under the north slope. A man who, if he could push Clara off her property before the 3-year mineral rights agreement expired, would have free access to everything under that ridge with no one left to raise any objection. James had not known. She was certain of that. James had needed the $200, and he'd taken what looked like a simple business arrangement, and he'd never lived long enough to understand what he'd handed over. But she knew now. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the lamp guttering toward darkness, and she felt something settle into her chest that was not fear. It was colder than fear and steadier than anger. It was clarity. She knew what Marsh was doing. She knew why, and now she needed to figure out what she could do about it. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the cedar chest. She blew a lamp. She went to bed. She did not sleep. Morning, she told Elias. She hadn't planned to. She'd woken up intending to keep it to herself, to work through it alone, the way she'd worked through everything for the past 14 months. She came out at dawn, and he was already at the fence line, and something about the simple, undemanding fact of him standing there in the early light, working steadily without needing anything from her, made the decision for her. She walked out to the fence line with 2 cups of coffee and held one out to him. He took it. He looked at her over the rim. He read her face the way he read fence lines and root edge quickly and accurately. Something happened, he said. I found some papers last night, she said. My husband's papers, she told him. All of it. The letter, mineral rights, initials that matched Marsh's name, the timeline, the loan, the pressure. She told it plainly and without embellishment, because that was the only way she knew how to tell things that mattered. Elias without interrupting. He held his coffee cup in both hands, and he watched her face, and he didn't say anything until she was done. Then he said, "He set the whole thing up before your husband even took the loan." "Yes, and if you lose the property, the mineral rights transfer automatically with the land title." "Yes, but if you pay the loan, the mineral rights agreement still stands for another 2 years regardless," Clara said. "At least I keep my land. At least I'm here to fight the survey access in court." "You'd need a lawyer for that. I know, and you said the only lawyer in 40 miles is on Marsh's payroll." "I know that too." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the north slope, where the ridge rose above the tree line in the early summer haze. "There's a federal land office in Durango," he said. Clara looked at him. "Federal surveyor has jurisdiction over mineral rights disputes on territory land," he said. "It's a 2-day ride. But if there's fraud in the original agreement, if Marsh misrepresented himself or the nature of the transaction to your husband, the federal office has authority to void the agreement and investigate." "How do you know that?" A pause. "It present. Had a situation once," he said. "Involving land, involving men who wanted it." She waited. He looked back toward the ridge. "My family's property. Up north of here, above Creed, 12 years ago." He didn't say anything else. She didn't ask. But the shape of it, the outline of what he wasn't saying, settled into the space between them, like something that had always been there and was only now being acknowledged. "Rango," she said. "Federal Land Office. Ask for the Territorial Surveyor's Office specifically." "Me. Bring the original letter and whatever other paperwork your husband had on the loan." "I can't be gone 2 days," Clara said. "The ranch." "I'll be here," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, as if the offer was simple and obvious, which maybe to him it was. "You don't have to," she started. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the patience in his voice was the kind that came from a man who had thought about something before he said it. "You bought 60 days of my labor. I got 51 left. I'll use them here." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She went inside to pack. She left before noon and rode hard and made it to Durango by the following evening. The Territorial Surveyor's Office was in a narrow building behind the Federal Land Registry, staffed by a man named Aldous Price, who had the look of someone who had been fighting paperwork battles for so many years that the battles had begun to show on his face. She laid the letter on his desk. She watched him read it. Watched his eyebrows move. "GHM acquisition," he said. "H. Marsh," Clara said. "First Territorial Bank of Black Pine County. He is simultaneously the holder of my loan note and the beneficiary of the mineral rights agreement." My husband didn't know they were the same person. Dean Price looked up at her over the top of his spectacles. "That is a significant conflict of interest," he said carefully. "Is fraud," Clara said. "Mr. Whit Price. His husband is dead. My ranch is the only thing I have." A man has been systematically constructing a situation in which he holds every card, my debt, my land rights, and whatever is under my north slope, and he is now applying pressure to force a sale before I can understand what I'm dealing with. I understand it now, so I'd like to know what the Federal Territorial Office can do about it." Epries looked at the letter again. He looked at the loan paperwork she'd laid beside it. He looked at the dates. Then he folded his hands on the desk and said, "If what you're telling me can be substantiated, the agreement may be voidable on grounds of misrepresentation. Additionally, a dual interest of this nature between a lending institution officer and a land purchaser may constitute bank fraud under territorial statute." "Can you send someone to Black Pine Valley?" "I can send a federal inquiry notice," Price said. "Which would compel the bank to suspend collection activities on your note pending investigation. That would give you calculated several months, at minimum. Potentially considerably longer if the fraud allegation holds up." Looked at him. "How long to file?" she asked. "I can have the preliminary inquiry notice drafted and dispatched by end of week," Price said. "And I'd like you to do that," Clara said. She rode back to Black Pine Valley the next morning. She returned to find the south gate hanging open. Not broken, not forced. Open, as if someone had simply ridden through it without closing it behind them, which was either carelessness or a message. She rode through it at a canter and pulled up at the barn. Elias came out before she'd dismounted, and she knew immediately from the set of his jaw that something had happened. "What?" she said. "Two men came yesterday evening," he said. "Not Marsh. Hired men. They said they were here to assess the property on behalf of the bank. I told them to leave, and—" He paused. After some discussion, she looked at him. His knuckles on his right hand were scraped raw. She looked at the knuckles. She looked at his face. He did not look away. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." "They leave of their own accord, or—" "They left," he said. All that needs saying about it. Clara dismounted. She handed him the reins without comment. She went to the water barrel and filled a rag, and brought it back and held it out to him. "At it. Your hand," she said. "It's fine." Elias, he was quiet for a beat. Then he took the rag. He pressed it against his knuckles, and he looked the north slope. Was what he always did when he was working something through inside himself and didn't want it read on his face. "They said things," he said. "About the property?" "About you." A pause. "About a widow who didn't know when she was beat." Clara said nothing. "I don't tolerate that kind of talk," he said. "About anyone." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come off an auction platform a week ago, who had said, "No, ma'am," and climbed into her wagon and fixed her gate latch, and set 7 fence posts in an afternoon and stood at her back when Marsh rode up, who had known about the federal land office in Durango and had told her to go without being asked, who had stayed and protected her property when she was 2 days' ride away. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "I went to Durango," she said. "I filed a federal inquiry notice against Marsh and the bank. If Price does his job, Marsh won't be able to touch the note for months." Something shifted in Elias's face, just slightly. The tightness around his eyes eased a fraction. He said, "There's something else," she said. "I need to look at the north slope, the part above the tree line where the survey markers are. I need to understand what's actually up there." "I know what's up there," Elias said. She stared at him. "I've been on your north slope," he said. "Not recently, but I've been up there, years ago, before any of this." "Know that ridge. What's there?" He looked at her steadily. "Nilver," he said. "Enough to matter." The word landed in the air between them and sat there. "Nah." Clara stared at him and felt something shift in the ground under everything she thought she understood. "How much?" She voice was barely above a breath. "I don't know exactly. But the vein runs along the underside of that ridge for at least a quarter mile. I saw outcroppings 12 years ago when I was trapping that area. I didn't think about it much then. Didn't have reason to." He paused. Else thought about it plenty. Marsh. Marsh had known. Marsh had known what was under that ridge when he'd shaken James Whitmore's hand and sold him a $200 mineral rights agreement, and then turned around and handed him a loan with 60-day terms. He had built the trap before the man walked into it. He had built it before James died. He might have been building it even before that. "Elias," she said, "if that silver is on my land." "It's your land," he said, "long as you can keep it." She looked at him. She thought about everything that had happened in the 7 days since she'd raised her hand in the town square and spent $3 and told Culliver, "I'll take him." She thought about how certain she'd been that it was just practicality. Just need. Just the simple math of a woman who needed a ranch hand and had no other option. She thought about a man standing on an auction platform with his hands hanging open, looking at the mountains. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she said. "About the ridge." "About the silver." He was quiet for a long moment. "Wasn't sure yet what kind of person you were," he said finally. "Wasn't sure if knowing would make things better or worse." Another pause, shorter. "And then I was sure. But you needed to go to Durango first, before I added anything else to what you were carrying." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is either the most considerate thing anyone has done for me in years or the most infuriating." "Be both," he said. She almost laughed. She didn't quite get there, but she almost did, and he saw it, and something in the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning, we go up to the ridge and we look at what's there." "And if Marsh sends more men in the meantime?" Clara looked back down the south road. "Then we deal with that too," she said. "But tonight I'm going to cook an actual supper with actual vegetables, and you are going to eat it at the table, like a person instead of taking a plate to the barn." He looked at her. She looked back unflinching. "I ain't much for," he started. "I know you're not much for company," she said. "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to sit at a table and eat food I've cooked. That's all." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He followed her inside. He sat at the table carefully, as if he wasn't entirely sure the chair would hold him, or maybe as if he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him and they ate. Not in comfortable silence. In the particular silence of two people who are figuring out what the other one is and finding the answer more complicated and more interesting than they'd expected. She refilled his coffee without asking. He ate everything on the plate and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, looking at the table, "Yeah, my family's land." Up above Creed, they took it the same way. She went still. Joan they couldn't pay. Men who showed up. Judge who was already bought. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Father tried to fight it. It didn't go well. She waited. "That's how I ended up on that mountain," he said. "After. Wasn't any place else I fit anymore." She looked at his face. At the bruise that was fading now to yellow at the edges. At the scar along his jaw that was old enough to be long past hurting. "They called the mountain wolf," she said. "That's what they settled on," he said, and there was something dry and exhausted and entirely unsurprised in his voice. "Man lives alone long enough. People need a story for why." "People always need a story," Clara said. "Usually it's easier than the truth." He looked up at her. "Truth is, I didn't have anywhere left to go," he said. "And up." She held his gaze. "You do, now, Aiden," she said, and she said it simply and without drama. She said things that she meant entirely. "If you want it. Whatever happens with this land, whatever Marsh does or doesn't do, you've got somewhere to be for as long as you want to be here." The silence that followed was very long. Elias Hawthorne looked at her, across the kitchen table, with an expression she couldn't entirely name. Something cracked open in it. Something that looked like a man who had heard a thing he'd stopped letting himself expect to hear. He didn't say anything. He looked back down at his coffee cup. But his shoulders, which had carried a permanent brace against the world since the first morning she'd seen him, dropped by something that was barely visible but completely real. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge, and somewhere above the tree line, under a quarter-mile of rock and shadow, Silver waited in the dark. And in the morning they would go up and look at it together. Yep, they sat at the table, and two people who had both been taken apart by the world and were, cautiously, beginning to figure out what they still had left. They went up to the ridge at first light. Clara had the letter folded in her coat pocket and a notebook in her hand. Elias walked ahead of her, on the narrow trail that cut through the pine trees toward the upper slope, moving with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had spent years reading terrain with his feet instead of his eyes. He didn't need to look down. He already knew where every root was, every loose stone, every place the ground would shift under a person's weight. She noticed that about him. He moved through time, like it was a language he'd been born speaking. The trail opened up above the tree line and the full ridge came into view, a long, ragged spine of exposed rock running east to west across the top of the property. Higher on the eastern end, where the formation pushed up out of the mountain, like a broken tooth. Elias stopped. He turned and looked at the rock face with the same expression he gave to everything he was reading, still, focused, taking it in without rushing. "There," he said. He pointed to a section of the eastern face where the rock changed color. Not dramatically. Just a subtle shift, a dark, almost greenish stain running through the gray stone in a diagonal line that started low and climbed steadily upward. The vein, Clara said. That's where it outcrops, he said. The vein itself runs back into the mountain. How far back, I couldn't tell you. But that stain, that's silver sulfide. Anybody who knows minerals knows what that is. Clara looked at the outcropping. She looked at the survey stakes, 3 of them, iron rods driven into the ground at intervals along the base of the face, each one flagged with a small piece of faded red cloth that had been there long enough to be weathered pale. She walked to the nearest stake and crouched down. Stake had a marking stamped into the iron, 2 letters and a number. She looked the next one, GHM2. He's already surveyed it, she said. Not a question. Looks like it was done a while back, Elias said. Those flags are old. Maybe more. Clara stood up. She looked at the stakes. She looked at the outcropping. She did the arithmetic in her head, the timeline of the mineral rights letter, the loan, the pressure, the men Marsh had sent, the way he'd said the men your husband borrowed against, as if they were already a certainty. He surveyed it before James took the loan, she said. Knew exactly what was here. He came in knowing. Yes, Elias said. And James, she stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. James hadn't, Elias said quietly. He didn't. She stood at the base of the ridge with the wind coming off the high rock above her, and her dead husband's name sitting in her chest like a stone, and she felt the grief and the fury arrive at the same time, and in equal measure. The way they always did when she thought about what James had not known and what had been done to him because he hadn't known it. She had not cried in front of anyone in 14 months. She did not cry now. She took out her notebook and wrote down the stake numbers and the location and the estimated length of the outcropping and the direction of the vein as far as she could read it. Will this help Price, she asked. It'll help him a great deal, Elias said. Physical evidence of pre-existing survey work combined with the dated letter and the loan agreement, that's not just a conflict of interest anymore. That's a documented pattern. That's a man who built a trap. I need to get this to Durango, she said. The federal inquiry notice Price sent should hold Marsh off the note, Elias said. But he doesn't know that yet, Clara said. Like Marsh, don't wait for paperwork to arrive before they make their next move. Looked at him. How long before he comes back? She said. If I had to reckon. Not long, he was right. Marsh came back that same afternoon. This time he brought 4 men, and none of them were dressed like bank representatives. They wore the clothing of working men, range clothes, dusty boots, but they rode too straight and too close together, and their eyes moved across the property with the specific surveying quality of men who had been told what to look for before they arrived. Clara came out of the barn when she heard them. Elias came out of the barn behind her. Marsh dismounted at the gate with his hat in his hand, and the pleasant smile was entirely gone now. He had the face of a man who had decided that pleasantness had run its course. Miss Whitmore, he said, I'm going to be honest with you today. I'd welcome a change, she said. He didn't react to that. The bank has been patient. We have been more than fair. But we have obligations to our investors, and those investors are no longer willing to wait out a 60-day note on a failing property. We are prepared to initiate early collection proceedings. Clara said, The note isn't due. Clause 9 of your loan agreement allows the bank to initiate proceedings if the bank determines the collateral is at risk of significant deterioration. My property is not deteriorating, Clara said. Look at the fence line. Look at the barn roof. This property is in better condition than it was 60 days ago. Miss Whitmore, the Federal Territorial Office in Durango is already aware of your dual interest as property, Mr. Marsh. She said it flat and clear and watched his face. They received a preliminary inquiry notice 3 days ago. I expect you'll be receiving your own copy of that notice within the week. The silence that followed was not long, but it was the kind of silence that contained a very large number of things. Marsh's jaw moved, just slightly, just enough to show that the information had landed. The mounted men behind him shifted in his saddle. "You filed a federal inquiry," Marsh said. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was not just gone now. Something harder had come up in its place, something with edges. "I did," Clara said. "On what basis?" "On the basis of the mineral rights agreement your company entered with my husband 13 months ago. GHM acquisition. Which, in case you were wondering whether I'd made the connection, I have." The color in Marsh's face shifted. Behind Clara, she heard Elias take a slow step forward. If Marsh's meant a big one, 18, heavy-set, 80. With a flat, patient face, had moved his hand to rest on the top of his thigh in a way that was not entirely casual. "Miss Whitmore." Miss Yarch said, and his voice had dropped. Gone private, as if the two of them were having a different conversation than the one that was actually happening. "You are making a very significant mistake. The men behind this investment are not men who respond well to interference." "I'm not interfering," Clara said. "I'm defending my property." "That is a distinction they will not appreciate. That," Clara said, "is their problem." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at Elias. "You," he said, "mountain man. You understand what kind of trouble you're standing in the middle of." Elias said nothing. "You were auctioned off like a mule 2 weeks ago," Marsh said. "You got no stake in this, no legal standing, no claim. Walk away from this woman's trouble, and I'll see to it the court debt is forgiven. Lean. You ride out of Black Pine Valley with nothing owed to anyone." The offer settled into the air. Clara did not look back at Elias. She kept her eyes on Marsh. She heard Elias breathe in. Then he said, "I'll take the debt." Marsh stared at him. "Debt," Elias said, "plain as wood. I'll keep it. I'll keep all 60 days, and I'll keep standing right here." Clara felt something move through her chest that she could not entirely name. Marsh looked between the two of them. His jaw tightened. "Ride out," Clara said. "Now." He did not move for a long moment. The heavy-set man behind him said, low and conversational, "Briggs." "We leaving, Marsh?" And the name was not Marsh now, but Briggs, a name she filed immediately, put his hat back on his head with deliberate care. "Now," he said. He mounted. He turned his horse. He and his 4 men rode down the south road, and this time there was nothing pleasant in the way they went. There was only the promise of return. Clara waited until the sound of hooves was completely gone. Then she said very quietly, "His name isn't Marsh." "No," Elias said, "Briggs." She turned to look at him. "You knew." "I knew the name," he said. "I wasn't certain it was the same man until just now." She stared at him. "His first name is Harlan," Elias said. Harlan Briggs. The name hit her like cold water. Harlan Briggs. The name Culliver had used at the auction. He trespassed across Harlan Briggs's north pasture and refused to move along peaceable. The same Harlan Briggs whose foreman Elias had put through a fence rail. The same Harlan Briggs who had arranged for Elias to be chained to an auction platform and sold for $3. The same man. The man who owned the land bordering her north slope was the same man who had been systematically acquiring mineral rights across Black Pine County. The same man who had sold her dead husband a fraudulent agreement. Same man who had been calling himself Gideon Marsh when he sat behind a banker's desk and called himself Harlington Briggs when he dealt with ranchers and land agents. "He put you on that platform," she said. "Yes," Elias said. A pause, short, the kind that meant the answer was not simple. "Because I knew about the ridge," Elias said. "I knew what was up there. I'd trapping that area for years, and I'd spoken to 2 different miners in the past 18 months about the outcropping. Nerd gets around in those circles." He stopped. "I think Briggs found out I'd been talking. I think he wanted me gone from this county. Fourth, a survey came in formally, and the real value of those deposits became public record." Looked at him. "He tried to remove you," she said. "Cheapest way to do it without anything that looked like a crime," Elias said. Get me arrested on a trespass charge, get me auctioned off 60 miles away, and by the time I worked off the debt and came back, the deal would be closed and done. Except I bought you, Clara said. Except you bought me, he said. And brought me back to the one property in this county he was most afraid of someone with knowledge being on. Clara looked at the south road. He knows you know about the silver, she said. He knows now for certain, Elias said. Before he might have only suspected. Stood here, yes. He knows. That makes you a target, she said. It makes both of us a target, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Tell me the rest of it, she said. About your family's land. Out Briggs. Tell me all of it, because I think I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with. He looked at her. Then he turned away from the south road and walked back toward the house, and she fell in beside him, and he talked. He talked for the better part of an hour. He sat at her kitchen table easier in the chair now than he'd been that first evening, as if the wood had accommodated itself to him or he to it, and he told it without decoration. 12 years ago, his family had owned property above Creede, Colorado. A working ranch, small but solid, that his father had built from bare ground over 20 years. His father, his mother, his younger sister. Elias had been 26 and running the upper pasture operation. A man had come offering to buy mineral rights to the western slope. A fair price, a 2-year agreement, nothing unusual. And his father had signed. Then, 6 months later, a different man had approached the bank that held their property loan, with evidence, fabricated evidence, Elias said. And his voice did not rise, but his hands tightened on the coffee cup of unpaid debts owed to a third party. The bank had called the loan. His father had fought it. The fight had gone badly, in the way that fights went badly when the judge was already bought, and the lawyer was already paid. They lost the property. His mother had died that winter. The cold, and what came before the cold. His sister had gone to live with relatives in Denver. Father had lasted 2 more years, working day labor, and then he had simply stopped. Elias had been 28 years old with nothing and nowhere, and he had gone up into the mountains because the mountains did not require anything of him except that he survive. He had been surviving up there for 12 years. The man who came from my father's western slope, Clara said, when he'd been quiet for a moment. Briggs, different name then, Elias said. But the same method, the same construction. Mineral rights bought, cheap loan called early, property transferred. Yes, she looked at her hands on the table. He's been doing this for over a decade, she said. At least that long, Elias said. Black Pine County isn't his first territory. And nobody stopped him. Nobody's had the right combination of things before, Elias said. Evidence of the original fraud, knowledge of the survey activity, and access to federal jurisdiction before the deal closes. He paused. You have all 3. We have all 3, she said. She looked back, steady. I am not doing this alone, she said. And neither are you. Not anymore. Something moved through his face slow, like light coming through cloud cover. He looked away. Looked back. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the miss attached to it, and they both noticed. Argue with me, she said. He didn't argue. He also didn't look away. They spent the rest of the afternoon and the whole of the evening making a plan. It was not a complicated plan, because complicated plans had too many points of failure. And they had limited time and limited resources, and at least 4 men working against them who would not be by anything that didn't land directly in front of them. Clara needed to get back to Durango with the survey stake evidence photographs if possible, detailed measurements if not, combined with a written account of Briggs's dual identity and the connection to the Creede property seizure 12 years ago. If could establish a patterns across multiple properties, across multiple years, the case moved from a local fraud complaint to a federal investigation. Federal investigators had reached that a territorial court did not. Elias needed to stay on the property, not just to protect it. To protect the evidence on the ridge, the stakes, the outcropping, the physical record of Briggs's pre-existing survey. If Briggs's men came back while Clara was gone and pulled those stakes, the physical evidence disappeared with them. "I'll be 2 days," she said, "maybe 3. I'll be here," he said. "They come, I can handle it." "Elias," she looked at him directly, "I'm not asking you to fight them. I'm asking you to be here. To be a witness. To be someone who can testify that the stakes were there and then were gone if they try to remove them." "I understand that," he said. "And if they come with bad intentions that extend beyond the ridge, then use your judgment," she said. "But don't get killed over iron stakes. Nothing on that ridge is worth your life." He looked at her. Some things are worth more than they look," he said. She didn't know exactly what he meant by that. She thought she might. She went to bed before 9 o'clock, because she intended to leave before dawn. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of him moving in the barn, the weight of him on the loft boards, the creak of timber settling. She had lived alone in this house for 14 months, and the sounds of the ranch at night had become the sounds of her own solitude, familiar and specific and unchanging. Different. This was the sound of someone else in the world with her, close enough to hear. She found it harder to sleep than usual. Not because it was frightening. Because it was not. She left at 4 in the morning. Elias was already up. He was at the barn door when she came out with her packed bag, and he had her horse saddled and her canteen filled and her saddlebag checked for the documents, without her having said a word about any of it. She stopped at the sight of him. "I figured you'd leave early," he said simply. She took the reins. 3 days at most, she said. No. She mounted. She looked down at him from the saddle in the gray pre-dawn, and he looked up at her with that face. She was beginning to be able to read the steadiness of it, the cost underneath the steadiness. The things he chose not to say, but that were present anyway in the way he held himself. "Elias," she said, "ma'am, when this is over," she said. "When Briggs is dealt with and the land is clear, I want you to stay." He was very still. "Not because I need a ranch hand," she said. "I want you to understand that. Not because of the 60 days or the labor. Because—" She stopped, found the words carefully, because they mattered, and she would not waste them. "Because I think this is where you're supposed to be. Me. And I think you know it." The silence was long. The mountains were beginning to show their outline against the sky just barely, just the dark shape of them against the slightly lighter dark of the early morning. "I'll be here when you get back," he said. It was not exactly an answer to what she'd said. It was also not an answer. She turned her horse south and rode. Made Durango in a day and a half, pushing hard and sleeping 3 hours in a dry creek bed when the horse needed rest. Price was in his office when she arrived, and when she laid the measurements and the stake records and the written account of Briggs's dual identity on his desk, he read through it with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Then he looked up and said, "Harlan Briggs." "You know him," Clara said. "I know," name Price said carefully. "There was an inquiry filed out of Creed 12 years ago regarding irregular land transfer proceedings. It was never substantiated." He paused. "The complainant died before the inquiry concluded." Clara stared at him. "His name was Elias Hawthorne," she said quietly. Elias was very still. "The son is alive," Clara said. "He's on my property right now. He's a witness to the original Creed survey activity, and he has knowledge of the Black Pine County operations going back 18 months. Will testify." Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to make several telegrams immediately." "I'd like you to wait." "I'll wait as long as it takes," she said. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, he had the expression of a man who had just pulled on a thread and felt something very large begin to move. "The Federal Land Commissioner's office in Denver has been building a case for 16 months regarding irregular mineral rights transfers across 3 Colorado counties," he said. "They have been missing a geographic anchor in Black Pine County. What you've brought me may be that anchor." He sat down. "I'm going to need you to sign a formal affidavit. And I'm going to need Mr. Hawthorne to sign one as well." "He'll sign," Clara said. "There's something else," Price said. If Briggs understands the federal scope of what's developing, he'll move, Clara said. He'll try to close the deal before the investigation locks in. Yes, Price said, which means you need to get back to your property. I need to get back tonight, she said. The affidavit will take. Shed, whatever you need, do it now. I'm not leaving this office without it done. They worked until after dark. She left Durango with signed affidavits, a federal hold notice on her property loan, and a letter from Price's office addressed to the federal commissioner in Denver marked urgent. She also left with a federal deputy's name, a man named Calhoun, stationed in Black Pine County, whom Price had already telegraphed. Ain't Calhoun when you get back, Price said at the door. If Briggs makes a move before the commissioner's men arrive, Calhoun has authority to intervene. How long before the commissioner's men? She asked. A week, Price said. Perhaps less. She thought about Elias alone on the property with Briggs knowing what Briggs knew. It needs to be less, she said. She rode through the night. She was halfway back when she smelled the smoke. Aim on the wind from the north, a faint, at first and then stronger, and she pushed her horse from a canter to a run, without stopping to think about it because she already knew what it was. She came over the last rise before the property and saw the glow against the sky. The barn, the south corner of the barn, was burning, not engulfed, not gone. Burning with the deliberate, accelerating purpose of a fire that had been set rather than started by accident. She came through the gate at full speed and pulled up and was off the horse before it had fully stopped. Elias, she was running. Here. His voice came from the east side of the barn, rough, present. Not the voice of an injured man, but the voice of a man who had been fighting something for a while. Came around the corner and found him. He was working the water barrel with a bucket, throwing it at the base of the fire on the corner post, and he had clearly been doing this for some time, because the fire had not taken the whole wall. Which meant he'd caught it early. Which meant he'd been watching for it. She grabbed the second bucket without a word and joined him. They worked the fire for 20 minutes. When it was down to smoking char and neither of them was throwing water anymore, she looked at him. He had a cut above his left eye. His shirt was torn at the right shoulder. His knuckles, both hands this time, were bloody. How many? She said. 3, he said. They came an hour before you. I heard them on the ridge first. They went up to the survey stakes. He paused. Pulled 2 of them. Her stomach dropped. Elias. I put them back, he said. She stared at him. I followed them up after, he said. After I dealt with the 3 here. I reset the stakes, and I marked the locations separately in case they come back for the others. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper covered in handwritten measurements and compass bearings. That's a record of every stake, exact locations, physical description. Dated tonight. She took the paper, she looked at it. She looked at him, at the cut and the torn shirt and the bloody hands and the absolute, bone-deep steadiness of his expression. You did all of this tonight, she said. Alone. You weren't here, he said simply. She felt something break open in her chest, not dramatically. Quietly. The way a window comes open in a house that has been shut up too long, just the latch giving way, and then air. Calhoun, she said. There's a federal deputy in town named Calhoun. I telegraphed him. We need to find him tonight. Night? Elias looked at the sky. It was well past midnight. Night, she said. Because Briggs knows we went to Durango. He knows what we brought back, and he is not going to wait for a federal commissioner from Denver. She looked at the smoking corner of the barn. It was a warning. The next thing he sends won't be. Elias looked at the barn, then he looked at her. You're right, he said. I know, she said. She went to her horse. She checked it was sound. She remounted. She looked down at him. Come with me, she said. He didn't hesitate. He went to the horse shed and had his own saddled in 3 minutes and came out and mounted, and they rode south together toward Black Pine Valley in the dark. The smoke from the barn still rising behind them, and the stars very bright and very cold overhead. and somewhere ahead of them in a town where everyone had laughed at the woman who spent $3 on the most feared man in the county, a federal deputy named Calhoun was about to have a very unexpected midnight knock at his door. Deputy Calhoun did not appreciate being woken at midnight. He came to the door of his rooming house with his suspenders hanging and the expression of a man who had been deeply asleep and intended to return there as quickly as possible. Clara. He looked at Elias. He looked at the state of both of them, the smoke smell, the blood on Elias's hands, the hard-ridden exhaustion on Clara's face, and his expression changed from irritated to alert in the space of a single breath. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "You received a telegram from Aldous Price in Durango," Clara said. "It was not a question." "I did," Calhoun said. "This afternoon." "Then you know what we're dealing with." He looked at them both again. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. They sat at his small table, and Clara laid out the affidavits and the stake measurements and Price's letter and the original mineral rights document, and she talked for 20 minutes straight without stopping. And Calhoun listened with his elbows on the table and his eyes moving between her face and the documents with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing was larger than it had appeared from the telegram. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harlan Briggs owns the Black Pine Valley Savings and Loan outright. He also owns the largest mining operation in the county under 3 different company names. Judge Colton has dismissed 2 previous complaints against his land acquisition practices in the past 4 years." "Judge Colton is bought," Clara said. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a serious situation," she said. Calhoun looked at Elias. "You're Hawthorne." "Yes," Elias said. "Price's telegram mentioned your name. Said you had knowledge of the Creed operations 12 years ago." "My father's property." "Same method, same result." "Testify to that formally." "I already signed the affidavit in Durango," Elias said. "I'll say it in any court that'll listen." Calhoun sat back in his chair. He ran a hand through his still sideways hair. "The federal commissioner's men are coming from Denver," he said. "Price told me 5 to 7 days. Briggs set fire to her barn tonight," Elias said. "He's already moved past warnings. He's not going to wait 5 to 7 days." "What do you need from me?" Calhoun said. "Ride out to the property with us tonight," Clara said. "As a federal witness. If Briggs's men come back while you're there, whatever they do happens in front of a deputy. And if Briggs tries to push the property transfer through Judge Colton before the commissioner arrives." "I can file an emergency federal hold," Calhoun said. "It bypasses the territorial court entirely. Colton can't touch it." "Can you do that tonight?" Clara said. "I can do it right now," he said. He was dressed and at his desk writing the hold within 5 minutes. He rode back to the property, 3 abreast in the dark, Calhoun on Clara's left and Elias on her right, and nobody said much because there was nothing useful to say. The hold was written and signed. The affidavits were in Calhoun's saddlebag. The next move was Briggs's. They all knew it. The barn corner was still smoking faintly when they rode through the gate, but it had not rekindled. Elias had built the original barn frame solid enough that the fire had eaten only the surface before he'd beaten it back, and what remained was charred but structurally intact. Calhoun looked at it. "He sent 3 men to do that," Elias said. "He sent 3 men. And they still didn't manage it," Calhoun said. "No," Elias said. Calhoun looked at Elias with a new quality of attention, the look of a man recalibrating what he was dealing with, not in a threatening way, but with something that was closer to respect than anything else. "I'll take the porch," Calhoun said. "You 2 get some sleep if you can." "In the barn," Elias said. "I'll be inside," Clara said. She went in. She lay down on her bed without removing her boots, and stared at the ceiling and was asleep in 4 minutes because her body had simply run out of available hours. She woke to the sound of horses at dawn. Not the soft, familiar sounds of her own animals in the paddock. The hard, purposeful sounds of horses coming fast up the south road, and multiple animals, more than 4. She was on her feet and at the door, before the sound fully registered in her waking mind. Calhoun was already on his feet at the porch rail. Elias was already outside, standing at the gate, and coming up the south road was Harlan Briggs with 8 men behind him and Judge Colton riding at his side. Clara stopped at the porch edge and looked at the size of what was coming and felt her stomach go cold. 8 men, the judge, and Briggs in front of them all with the face of a man who had decided the time for subtlety was completely finished. They pulled up at the gate. Briggs didn't dismount this time. "Miss Whitmore," he called, loud enough to carry to the porch. "Judge Colton has issued a foreclosure order on this property effective immediately. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings." Calhoun stepped forward from the porch. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Calhoun," he said loud and clear. That foreclosure order is superseded by the federal emergency property hold filed at 2 o'clock this morning, under the authority of the Territorial Federal Commissioner's Office in Denver. This property is under federal jurisdiction pending investigation. Territorial court order has standing here. Judge Colton, a thin man with a gray beard, and the permanently aggrieved expression of someone who had been comfortable for too long to tolerate disruption, pulled himself up in his saddle. "I am not aware of any federal hold," he said stiffly. "You are now," Calhoun said. He held up the document. "I'll file a copy at the Federal Registry in Durango today. You're welcome to contest it before the federal commissioner when his men arrive from Denver. That'll be in approximately 5 days." Briggs looked at Calhoun. His jaw was working. "You have no authority to," he started. "I have precisely the authority I stated," Calhoun said. "I'd recommend, Mr. Briggs, that you consider carefully what you do in the next 60 seconds, because a federal deputy is standing in front of you, and everything you say and do from this point forward is part of the official record." The 8 men behind Briggs had gone very still. These were hired men, and hired men understood the difference between a local dispute and a federal matter. A local dispute had outcomes that could be managed. A federal matter had outcomes that followed you. Briggs understood it too. He sat on his horse and looked at Calhoun and then at Clara and then at Elias, and his face cycled through several things in quick succession fury, calculation. And something that was almost fear but was too practiced to quite get there, and then he pulled his horse around without a word and rode back down the south road, and the 8 men went with him, and Judge Colton went last. And the judge's expression as he turned away was the expression of a man who knew he had just been on the wrong side of something that was about to become very large indeed. Clara stood on the porch and watched them go. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs so nobody would see it. Calhoun looked at her. "You all right, Miss Whitmore?" "Fine," she said. Her voice was steady. "Thank you, Deputy." "Don't thank me yet," Calhoun said. "He'll find another angle." "Men like Briggs always do. What angle does he have left?" she said. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. "The mineral rights agreement is still technically valid until Price's investigation voids it," he said. "If Briggs decides to begin physical extraction on the ridge before the federal hold extends to cover the survey rights." "He can't extract without equipment," Elias said. He had walked back from the gate and was standing at the foot of the porch steps. "Not from that vein. It's deep enough that you'd need at least a small stamp mill and a crew of 10, minimum." "Could he bring equipment in fast enough?" Clara said. Elias thought about it. "Not before Denver's men arrive. Not if you push Price to move the timeline. Then I need to go back to Durango," Clara said. "You were just in Durango," Calhoun said. "Yes," she said. "I need to go again." She looked at Elias. He looked back at her. "I'll go," he said. She stared at him. "You've been the one riding," he said. "You've done 2 days of hard travel in 3 days. Know the Durango road." He paused. "And I know Price or I will by the time I'm done talking to him. Let me go." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who found it easy to let other people carry things for her. Nay, she had spent 14 months being entirely certain that if she put anything down even briefly, it would not be there when she reached for it again. She said. "Calhoun's here," Elias said. Looked at Calhoun. "I'm not going anywhere," Calhoun said. She looked back at Elias. Something passed between them that was not quite words, and not quite anything else, a negotiation conducted entirely in the language of two people who had been paying close attention to each other for 2 weeks and had learned how to read what the other one wasn't saying. "Be back by day after tomorrow," she said. "Tonight if the horse holds," he said. He went and saddled up and rode south, and she watched him go from the gate the same way he had watched her go 2 days before, and she understood now why he had stood there as long as he did. It was not a comfortable thing to watch someone ride away when you had started to depend on them being there. The day was long and quiet in the way that days were quiet when something large was gathering just outside of view. Calhoun kept watch. Clara worked. She repaired the barn corner as much as she could with what she had, mixing fresh mud into the charred gaps, replacing the worst of the burned exterior boards from the lumber she'd had stacked for the roof repair. Neighbors came, not the ones she'd expected, not the Dodds, who had watched her drive out of the auction square, with tight-lipped disapproval, but the Millers from the East Road, old Hank Pierce who ran the feed operation 2 miles north, and a woman named Josephine Tatum who had lost her own husband the year before and had been managing a small horse operation alone since. Josephine Tatum looked at the burned barn corner and said, "I heard what Briggs tried to do this morning." "News travels fast," Clara said. "It does when people are watching," Josephine said. "Half the county has been watching you, Clara. Watching to see if you'd fold." "I didn't fold," Clara said. "No," Josephine said. "Didn't." She paused. "There's others in this county who've had dealings with that man, and his bank and his acquisition companies. Others who kept quiet because they were alone." She looked at Clara steadily. "They're not quiet anymore." By early afternoon, Clara had 6 signed statements from neighboring property owners documenting irregularities in their own dealings with First Territorial Bank and its associated land acquisition interests. To ascribed survey activity on their properties that preceded loan calls by less than a year. The pattern that Price had called a missing anchor was beginning to look like an entire map. She was organizing the statements at the kitchen table when she heard the commotion outside. She came to the door. Wagon had come up the south road, not Briggs's men, not anything threatening, just a wagon with 2 men on the bench, and both men were strangers, and Calhoun was talking to them at the gate with his hand on his sidearm. Then one of the men said something, and Calhoun's hand came off his sidearm, and Calhoun turned toward the house. "Miss Whitmore," he called, "you need to come hear this." The 2 men were miners. Not current miners, former miners, they said, who had worked a claim up near the Creed territory 12 years ago and had been subcontracted by a survey operation to document mineral deposits in a specific area. The area included the property above Black Pine Valley. Documented that silver vein 11 years ago, the older of the 2 said. His name was Ferris. He had the hands and the face of a man who had spent decades in hard environments. Wrote it up and filed the report, got paid, and that's. Never thought about it again until the federal marshal's office sent out an inquiry 2 weeks ago, asking about survey records from that period. Clara went very still. "The federal marshal's office," she said. "Out of Denver," Ferris said. "They've been looking at Briggs for a while, ma'am." "Longer than you might think." He looked at her carefully. "They sent us down here because our survey report from 11 years ago was filed under a company name that doesn't match anything in the public record. Company name was GHM Mineral Solutions, the same initials. Different name, same man. He was operating under that name before he set up in Black Pine Valley," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am. And the Denver office believes they can tie at least 6 property seizures across 3 counties to survey that preceded loan calls under that company name." Ferris paused. "They've been building this case for 16 months, like I said." What they didn't have was someone on the ground in Black Pine County who could connect the physical evidence to the existing documentation. "Until now," Clara said. "Until you filed that complaint in Durango," Ferris said. "That's what opened the door, ma'am. That's what connected it all." She sat back in her chair. She thought about James. about a letter he'd signed without knowing what he was signing. About a man who had been building a trap for years before the trap was ever sprung. About Elias Hawthorne on an auction platform, chained and sold for $3 to get him out of the county before anyone started pulling the pieces together. She thought about $3. When are the Denver men arriving? She asked. Day after tomorrow, Ferris said. Maybe sooner. Deputy Marshal Calhoun here can confirm the timeline. Calhoun nodded. That means Briggs has less time than he thought, Clara said. Yes, ma'am, Ferris said. And he knows it. We passed through town on our way out here, and the word is already spreading that federal men are coming. You should know Briggs has been at the bank since this morning. His people have been moving documents. Clara looked at Calhoun. Can you stop that, she said. Not without a specific federal seizure order, Calhoun said. Don't have yet. Then we need Elias back, she said. With whatever Price can give us. He said tonight if the horse holds, Calhoun reminded her. I know what he said. She stood up. Mr. Ferris, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Every detail, with dates. She pushed a pen and paper across the table. And I need you to be willing to say it again, in front of a federal commissioner. That's why Denver sent us, he said. He picked up the pen. Elias came back at dusk. She heard his horse before she saw him, and she was at the gate before he'd fully pulled up. And the look on his face when he saw her standing there, the fractional softening of a man who has been riding hard for the better part of 20 hours and has been thinking about what he was riding back to, told her more than he probably intended. He dismounted. He was exhausted. She could see it in the way he moved, still controlled, still deliberate, but with the specific heaviness of a man running close to his limit. Filed the extended survey rights hold, he said before she could speak. Covers the ridge. No extraction activity can begin without federal authorization. Briggs can't touch the silver. He knows federal men are coming, she said. In moving documents, Elias absorbed that. Ferris and another miner came from Denver, she said. Survey records from 11 years ago. The Denver office has been building a case for 16 months. We're the piece that connects it. He looked at her for a long moment. It's over, he said. Not triumphantly, just recognizing a fact. Not until Denver's men arrive and Briggs is formally in custody, she said. Yeah, I think it's over. He handed her his horse's reins, not asking her to take them, but simply transferring the weight as if it were the natural continuation of everything they had been doing together. And she took them without comment and led the animal to the paddock while he walked to the water barrel and stood there, with his hands braced on the rim and his head down. She put the horse in the paddock. She came back. She pumped fresh water into the basin and set it beside him without a word. He washed his hands. He washed his face. He stood up and pushed the water from his eyes with the backs of his wrists, and he looked at her in the early evening light, and she looked back at him. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things had accumulated, past the point where words were the right instrument for them. You're bleeding again, she said. His right knuckles had reopened on the ride. I'm fine. I know you're fine, she said. You're bleeding anyway. Went inside and came back with a cloth and sat on the fence rail and held out her hand. Looked at it. Elias, she said patiently. He sat beside her on the rail. He put his hand in hers. She wrapped the cloth around his knuckles and tied it and did not let go right away. When this is done, she said. When Denver's men have come and gone and Briggs is dealt with and the land is legally clear, she stopped. She kept her eyes on his hand. What do you want? He was quiet. I'm not asking what you'll settle for, she said. I'm asking what you want. The evening was very still. The mountains to the north were going dark, the ridge losing its detail into shadow, the silver beneath it invisible and silent and waiting. He stopped. Tried again. I've been on that mountain for 12 years, Clara. I know how to survive. I know how to be alone. Another stop. I don't know how to want things anymore. I stopped letting myself. Looked at him. Then start again, she said. Here, he looked at her face, her honest, tired, absolutely serious face. This, he said. low. "This ranch?" she said. "This," he said again, and the way he said it the second time made it clear he did not mean the ranch. Something opened in her chest, that window again, wide this time, all the way. "Didn't say anything." She turned back to his hand, finished the wrapping, straightened the knot. She did not let go. He did not pull away. They sat on the fence rail in the gathering dark while Calhoun kept watch on the porch and the horses moved softly in the paddock and somewhere on the south road, completely unsuspecting. The last 24 hours of Harlan Briggs's career as an untouchable man were quietly counting down to their end. The Denver men arrived not in 5 days but in 3. 4 federal deputies and an assistant commissioner named Hargrove, who had the look of a man who had been working this particular case in particular for a very long time, and had been waiting for exactly the end of anchor that Clara's complaint had provided. They came to the property first. Hargrove sat at Clara's kitchen table and read every document she had, and asked her questions for 2 hours. And when he was done, he shook her hand and said, "Miss Whitmore, Miss, you have done what a great many people, with considerably more resources than you have been unable to do." "I had help," she said. She looked at Elias, who was standing at the back of the room. Hargrove looked at him too. "Mr. Hawthorne, the creed connection, your testimony is critical to the pattern of behavior argument. You understand what that means?" "It means I'll finally be saying out loud what happened to my father," Elias said. "Yes, I understand." Hargrove nodded. Something in his face acknowledged the weight of that in the particular way of a man who had heard many versions of the same story and had not yet become fully numb to any of them. "We're going to the bank this afternoon," Hargrove said. "I'd like both of you present." The arrest of Harlan Briggs happened at 2 in the afternoon in front of the First Territorial Bank of Black Pine Valley. It was not dramatic in the way that such things were dramatic in stories. There was no chase and no gunfight and no final confrontation with speeches delivered on either side. Nay, there was only a man in a good coat coming out of the bank door and stopping dead at the sight of 4 federal deputies and an assistant commissioner blocking his way. And the moment when the pleasant smile, the one he had worn for everyone in every business meeting and every foreclosure visit and every land acquisition conversation for over a decade finally and completely gave way to the face underneath it. The face underneath was afraid. Clara watched it happen from across the street. She stood with Elias and Calhoun and Josephine Tatum and old Hank Pierce, and a growing number of people who had gathered because word in a small town traveled fast. And she watched Harlan Briggs's hands be taken and the document be read to him and the thing be done. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and clear. And clean in a way she had not felt in a very long time. Elias stood beside her. He did not say anything. He stood close enough that his arm was against her shoulder, and he stayed there, solid and quiet. While Briggs was walked to the deputy's wagon, and the crowd around them buzzed with the specific excited noise of a community, realizing it had been lied to for years and that the lie was now over. Dodd, the neighbor who had told her she'd lost her mind in the auction square, appeared at Clara's left side. He looked at the wagon where Briggs was being loaded. He looked at Clara. He said, "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore." "Yes," she said, "you do." He blinked. He had perhaps expected something more gracious. "I accept it," she added, "but I don't need it." She turned away from him. She turned back to Elias. He was watching her with that face. She had learned to read the one that looked like nothing on the surface and contained everything underneath. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Elias, you told him yes and no in the same breath," he said. "Right order. Was that wrong?" "No," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "It was exactly right." She looked at him. He looked back. Around them, the town of Black Pine Valley reorganized itself around a new truth, and the afternoon sun came down on the main street, and the mountains stood behind everything, patient as they had always been, full of silver that now belonged to the woman who had refused to let it be taken from her. And standing beside her was the man no one had wanted. The man she had bought for $3. The man who had turned out to be the most valuable thing in the entire county. Not for the silver, not for what he knew, but for what he had chosen, every single day, to be. The day after Briggs was taken away in that federal wagon, the silence felt different. Not the silence of a woman alone on a failing ranch, counting days until a banknote came due. Not the silence of 14 months of grief pressing down on every room in the house. This was the silence of something, the particular quiet that settled after a long storm when the air was still charged, but the worst of it had passed. Ata woke before dawn, the way she always did, and she lay in bed for a moment and took inventory of the world, the way she had every morning for the past 14 months, cataloging what remained and what didn't. Note on the property was frozen under federal hold, pending full investigation. Price had confirmed that the original mineral rights agreement was being voided on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. Hargrove's office would be filing federal charges against Briggs, whose real name, as additional documentation from Denver had confirmed, actually Harold Gideon Marsh Briggs, which explained the initials and also explained a great deal about a man who changed names the way other men changed coats. The ranch was hers, the silver in the ridge was hers, and the man sleeping in the barn loft had 11 days left on his 60-day court labor agreement. Up, she put on her boots, she went outside. He was already at the water barrel, the way he always was. She had stopped being surprised by it a week ago. She simply accepted it as one of the fixed facts of early morning, like the way the light came first to the eastern ridge, and the way the horses always moved to the south fence at sunrise looking for the first grass. She walked to him and held out a cup of coffee. He took it. They stood at the water barrel and drank their coffee in the early gray light without speaking, the way they had developed the habit of doing, not because there was nothing to say, but because this particular silence had become something they both valued. It was not the silence of people who had run out of words. It was the silence of people who had enough words between them that they didn't always need to use them. Hargrove's men left this morning, she said. I saw them ride out, he said. Calhoun, yes. She looked toward the north ridge. The early light was just beginning to touch the top of it, the very peak going gold, while everything below was still gray. 11 days, she said. He was quiet. On the agreement, she said. 11 days left. I know how to count, he said. I know you do. She looked at her coffee cup. I want to talk about what comes after. He turned his head to look at her. You said the other night on the fence rail. She stopped. Started again. You said this. When I asked what you wanted. I remember what I said, he said. I want to know if you meant it. The pause that followed was short, but it was the kind of short pause that contained a great deal of deliberation. I meant it, he said. Then I need you to understand what this actually is, she said. This is a ranch that needs rebuilding from the ground up. Is a silver deposit that is going to require legal negotiations I've never navigated before. This is a county full of people who spent 2 weeks calling you a wild man and me a fool, and who are now going to spend the next year trying to figure out how to act like they didn't. She paused. This is not simple, this is not easy. And I want to be honest with you, I am not a simple or easy person. No, he said, you're not. I'm telling you that as a warning. I'm receiving it as a fact, he said. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I already know what you are. She looked at him, she said. And I'm still standing here, he said. Something settled in her chest, deep and quiet and absolutely certain, the way things settled when they were true. All right, she said. All right, he said. She went inside to start breakfast. Went to the barn to start work, and the day began. The letter from Denver arrived days later. It came by federal courier, a young man on a fast horse who handed Clara a sealed envelope with the commissioner's seal on it, and waited while she read it, and then asked if there was a reply. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and read it a third time. The federal commissioner's office had completed its preliminary investigation of Briggs's operations across Black Pine and 2 neighboring counties. The investigation had confirmed fraud in 19 separate land transactions over an 11-year period. Criminal charges had been filed. Additionally, investigation had determined that the original mineral rights agreement signed by James Whitmore was void ab initio, meaning legally it had never existed at all, not just that it was cancelled, that it had never been valid from the moment it was signed, because it had been obtained through deliberate, material misrepresentation. That meant the silver in the ridge had always been entirely hers. That also meant something else. She kept reading. The Commissioner's Office, in recognition of the extraordinary public value of exposing a fraud operation of this scope and duration, and in recognition of the specific material contribution of Mr. Elias Hawthorne's testimony regarding the free-flinging of the Creed operation, for federal charges, was prepared to formally petition the territorial court for the expungement of Mr. Hawthorne's outstanding debt and the voiding of the labor agreement order. On his 60 days gone, formally, legally, completely erased. She set the letter on the table. She sat with it for a moment. Then she called to the courier. No reply yet. Give me 10 minutes. She went to the barn. He was replacing the burned corner post, the last real structural damage from the fire, working with the focused, quiet efficiency she had come to understand as simply the way he existed in the world. He heard her come in and looked over his shoulder. He read her face. He set down the post. What happened, he said. The Commissioner's Office voided the labor agreement, she said. Your debt is expunged. You're free. He looked at her. Effective immediately, she said. You don't owe anyone anything. Order is gone. He was very still. Free, he said. Not a question, just the word turned over, examine. Yes, she said. He looked at the half-replaced corner post. He looked at the barn around him, the things he'd fixed, and the things still needing fixing, and the roof he'd shored, and the fence line that ran straight and true for the first time in years. He looked at her. I'd like to finish the post, he said. She stared at him. You're free. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to finish the post. It's not right to leave a corner post half set. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. She went back to the courier and wrote a reply, received and understood. Thank you. She sent him off. She came back to the barn. She picked up the other end of the post. He looked at her. Level, he said. I know how to hold a post, she said. Always let it drift left, he said. She had not known he'd noticed that. She straightened the post. They set it together. 3 days after the letter arrived, something happened in town that Clara would not fully understand the significance of until later. She drove in for supplies, flour and coffee and nails and a length of new rope, and Elias came with her, which he had not done before. He had avoided Black Pine Valley the way a man avoided a place where he'd been publicly humiliated, which was entirely reasonable, and she had not pressed him on it. But on this particular morning, he simply climbed up onto the wagon bench beside her, without explanation, and she drove them both into town without comment. The square was busy, a Thursday market day, people from surrounding ranches and farms in for their weekly provisions. They pulled up at the general store. And something happened that she had not anticipated. Hank Pierce came over from the feet African across the square, moving with the determined speed of a man who had decided on something and intended to carry it out before he could reconsider. He came up to the wagon and he looked at Elias and he put out his hand. I owe you an apology, Pierce said. I laughed at that auction. I ain't proud of it. Elias looked at the outstretched hand. Then he shook it. Appreciate it, he said. Pierce nodded and went back across the square. Before Clara had finished tying off the horse, 2 more men had come over. Then a woman, the wife of the miller, who had pressed her lips together at the auction and said nothing, and who now pressed them together again and said, You did right by this county, Mr. Hawthorne, and I'm sorry we made it harder than it needed to be. Ma'am, Elias said. She went on her way. Anne. Clara watched it happen the way you watch something you had hoped for, but had not been certain of, with a careful, contained relief, not wanting to press too hard, in case it was more fragile than it looked. It was not fragile. By the time they came out of the general store with their supplies, Culliver the auctioneer himself The man who had made jokes from the platform while Elias stood in chains was waiting at the wagon, and with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had spent several days building up to an extremely uncomfortable but necessary action. "Mr. Hawthorne," Culliver said. Elias stopped. "I conducted that auction," Culliver said. "And I conducted it the way I did because—" He stopped. "Tried again. Because it was easy. Because everybody else was laughing and it was easy." He turned his hat in his hands. "There ain't any justification for it. I'm sorry." The square was not entirely quiet, but the people nearby had slowed, and the moment had the specific texture of something being watched with careful attention. Elias looked at Culliver for a long moment. Clara did not move. "I know what easy looks like," Elias said finally. "Don't hold it against the man. I hold it against the choice." He paused. "You're making a different one now. That counts for something." Culliver let out a breath. He put his hat back on. "It won't happen again," he said. "Not in my auction yard." Elias said. They loaded the wagon. They drove out of Black Pine Valley. Neither of them said anything for the first mile. Then Clara said, "You handled that better than I would have." "No, you wouldn't," he said. "You'd have been polite about it." "I told Dot he owed me an apology, and then basically told him I didn't need it." "That was polite for you," he said. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing that was not quite a smile. She faced the road and said nothing, but she was smiling. The silver negotiations took the better part of 2 months. Hargrove's office connected her with a territorial mining attorney named Delacroix, who operated out of Denver and who turned out to be exactly the kind of man you wanted on your side in a negotiation involving significant mineral deposits. Relentless, meticulous, and completely unsentimental about money. Delacroix made 3 trips to the property and spent 2 days on the ridge with his own survey team and came back with numbers that made Clara sit down and put her hand over her mouth and breathe carefully for a moment. "The vein is substantial," Delacroix said, in the tone of a man who had learned to deliver financial revelations with clinical understatement. "Conservative estimate puts the extractable yield at a figure that would, with proper licensing agreements and a reputable extraction partner, eliminate your existing loan note many times over and provide a sustained income for this property for the better part of a decade." She looked at the numbers on his paper. She thought about $37. She thought about the ledger she had opened every morning for 2 months and the numbers that never changed in her favor. "I want to keep the ranch," she said. "Whatever we negotiate with the mining operation, the ranch stays a ranch. The pastures stay pastures. The horses stay. Nothing above the tree line touches what's below it." Delacroix nodded as if this was entirely reasonable, which to him it was, because he had negotiated mining contracts in 7 territories, and this was not an unusual condition. "It can be written into the agreement," he said. "Then write it in," she said. She signed the preliminary agreement 3 weeks later. She signed it at the kitchen table with Elias sitting across from her and Delacroix beside her, and the window opened to let in late summer air, and when she set down the pen she looked at the document for a moment, and then she looked at Elias. He was watching her with those steady eyes. "James would have wanted this," she said. Not to Delacroix, to Elias. He worked this land for 8 years. He would have wanted it to be something real. "It is something real," Elias said. She said, "It is." Delacroix gathered his papers with the practiced discretion of a man who understood when a moment belonged to other people. The 60 days were long past by then. Nobody counted them anymore. Elias stayed. He stayed because she had asked him to, and because he had said this on a fence rail in the dark and meant it, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. But it was more than that too, and both of them knew it was more than that, and the knowing accumulated in the ordinary details of shared days, the way he always had her coffee ready, when she came out in the morning, the way she always left a lamp in the window when he was working late in the barn, the way they had developed a kind of operational shorthand that made the ranch run smoother than it ever had when it was one person managing everything. It was not a grand or sudden thing between them. It was built the way good things are built, steadily, with attention in the accumulated weight of small actions chosen deliberately over time. She asked him once, in the early fall when the nights were starting to cool and the aspens on the ridge were going gold, how he had learned to fix things the way he did the fences, the barn, the roof, the gate latch, the 100 small structural problems of a ranch that had been managed by one person for too long. My father, he said, the same answer he'd given on the roof that first week. He taught you to do all of it? He used to say, Elias, stop. He was looking toward the ridge, the way he did when something was costing him to say. He used to say that the most important thing a man could do was leave things in better shape than he found them. He paused. I stopped believing that for a while. When you were on the mountain, she said. When I was on the mountain, he said. Didn't see the point. Wasn't anything I was responsible for up there. And now, she said. He looked at the fence line running straight and true and solid, repaired section by repaired section, over the course of 8 weeks. Now I see the point again, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. This was the thing about Elias Hawthorne, that she had come to understand completely. He did not perform feelings. He did not arrange them into presentable shapes for other people's comfort. What he felt, he showed only when it was real, and only to people he trusted to receive it accurately. She was the only person in the world he trusted that way. She understood what that meant. She understood what it cost him. She also understood what it meant that she extended him the same trust in return, that she had told him things she'd told no one else. Shown him the ledger and the grief and the fury and the exhaustion and the hope that she kept carefully managed so it wouldn't become too heavy a thing to carry if it didn't work out. It was working out. She had not expected that. And 14 months into widowhood, $3 in her pocket, on a ranch that was dying. She had not expected any of this. The twist that came in October arrived in the form of a letter she had not anticipated. It was from Hargrove's office, and it was straightforward in its language and devastating in its implication. Briggs's defense attorney had filed a motion arguing that Elias Hawthorne's testimony, the Creed testimony that had established the pattern of behavior critical to the federal case, was compromised by personal bias. Given that Hawthorne's family had been a direct victim of Briggs's earlier operations. The attorney was arguing that the testimony should be struck from the federal record. If the testimony was struck, the pattern of behavior argument collapsed. If that argument collapsed, the federal case narrowed significantly back to Blackpine County alone, back to a smaller set of charges. With a realistic possibility that Briggs's attorney could negotiate a settlement that involved penalties but no prison time. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. Then she went to find Elias. He was at the upper fence line, the last section that hadn't been fully rebuilt. The letter where he stood. He read it once and handed it back. They're trying to discredit me, he said. Yes, because without the Creed connection, it's just Blackpine County. End case. Yes, and if it's smaller stakes. He might not go to prison, Clara said. He might pay a fine. He might walk out of a federal holding facility in Denver in 18 months and start over somewhere else. Elias was quiet. The wind came down from the ridge and moved through the grass between them and went on. What do we do? She said. He looked at the letter. Need corroboration, he said. My testimony alone is a man with a grievance. My testimony plus documented evidence is something else. What documented evidence exists from 12 years ago? My father's original loan papers, he said, if they still exist. The survey company that operated under the GHM name in Creed Ferris said they filed a report. That report exists in federal records. Ferris has already provided that to Hargrove, she said. But there's something else. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. There's a woman in Creed named Eleanor Voss. She was my father's nearest neighbor. She was at the property the day the final eviction happened. She saw everything. He paused. I haven't spoken to her in 12 years. I don't know if she's still there. I don't know if she'd talk. Looked at him. I need to go to Creed, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Creed was 3 days' ride north. It was up October. The mountain passes were not yet closed, but they were getting close. I know, she said. If I leave now, I'll be here, she said. Nettie. He looked at her. I know, she said again, and this time she meant something slightly different by it, and they both understood that too. She left the next morning. She swatched up the next north and did not let herself stand at the gate too long. She had a ranch to run. He was gone for 9 days. On the 4th day, she received a telegram from him, 3 sentences. Eleanor Voss is alive. Testify, coming back. She read those 3 sentences 4 times. Then she folded the telegram and put it in her apron pocket and went back to work. He came back on the 9th day in the late afternoon, riding hard, coming up the South Road with the specific urgency of a man who has been away and is correcting that condition as fast as his horse will allow. She was at the gate when he arrived. He pulled up and dismounted, and he was travel-worn and tired, and his jaw was dark with 9 days of growth, and he looked at her like a man who had been away and was making sure everything he'd left behind was still there. Eleanor Voss, she said. 81 years old, he said. Sharp as a new nail. She kept a journal, wrote in it every day for 40 years. He stopped. Including the day they took my father's property. She has the date, the men's names, and a physical description of the transaction. He paused. Anne. She has the name Briggs wrote on the survey company certificate that day. What is it? Harold Gideon Marsh Briggs, he said. The same name Denver just confirmed. Clara felt something click into place with the solidity of a lock engaging. Her journal entry plus Ferris's survey report plus the federal name confirmation, she said. That's 3 independent sources, establishing the same identity, across the same time frame. That's not bias, he said. No, she said. That's a conviction. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Yeah. And then he did something he had not done before in all the weeks they had been building this thing between them. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face, just his palm against her cheek. He's warm. Rough. And he held it there for a moment, with the simple, complete certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. She put her hand over his. They stood at the gate of the Whitmore ranch in the October afternoon light. The mountains behind them, going from gold to shadow, the ridge above the tree line catching the last of the sun. And they stood there like that for a long moment that required nothing more from either of them than exactly what it was. The federal trial of Harold Gideon Marsh took place in Denver in the spring. Clara and Elias rode up together. Eleanor Voss was already there, installed in a boarding house, 3 blocks from the courthouse and apparently entirely unintimidated by the proceeding, given that she had been waiting 12 years for the opportunity and had brought her journal. The testimony took 3 days. Elias was on the stand for the better part of an afternoon, and he spoke the way he did everything plainly, specifically, without embellishment or performance, every word placed exactly where it needed to be, and not a single one wasted. Clara sat in the gallery and watched him and thought about the man who had stood on an auction platform in chains and looked at the mountains because there was nothing else worth looking at. And she thought about how many versions of a person could exist inside one life if the circumstances allowed them to emerge. Jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with guilty on 11 of 14 counts, including federal land fraud, fraudulent misrepresentation, and criminal conspiracy spanning multiple jurisdictions over a period of 12 years. Harlan Briggs was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He was led out of the courtroom past the gallery, and he walked past Clara and Elias without stopping, without turning his head. But Clara watched his face as he passed, and she saw something there that she had not expected to see, not anger, not defiance, a specific, hollowed exhaustion. Face of a man who had run a very long and very complicated con and had finally, completely run out of road. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt sorry for her husband, who had not lived to see it. She felt sorry for Elias's father, who had not lived to see it either. She sat in the gallery after the room had cleared, and she sat quietly for a moment with those two sorrows, giving them the space they deserved. Elias sat beside her. He didn't try to move her past it. Nah, he just sat there, his arm against hers, and present and patient, the way he was present and patient with everything that mattered. After a while, she said, "James would have liked you." Elias looked at her. He had no patience for nonsense, she said. And he respected people who worked hard and meant what they said. "Abar," Elias said. "You'd have cleared it," she said. He looked at his hands. "Your father would have liked this ranch," she said. "He would have liked what you've done with it." Elias was quiet for a long moment. He said, "He would have." She took his hand. Nay. He held it. They sat in the empty Denver courthouse, with spring coming in through the high windows. Two people, who had been broken by the world in different ways at different times, sitting with their losses and their victories together, which was the only way either could be properly held. They were married in June. Not in the church, in Black Pine Valley, because neither of them was particularly interested in spectacle. In the front yard of the Whitmore Ranch, with Calhoun standing up with Elias and Josephine Tatum standing up with Clara and old Hank Pierce conducting the proceeding, because it turned out Hank had a Justice of the Peace certification from 20 years ago that he had never mentioned to anyone, and he produced with visible pride when asked. It was a short ceremony. It was exactly right. Afterward, standing in the yard with the summer sun full on them, and the mountains visible in every direction, and the ridge above the tree line, bright and permanent in the midday light, Josephine Tatum handed Clara a glass of something cold and said, "I always said you were the most stubborn woman in this county." "You did not always say that," Clara said. "You only started saying that recently." "I thought it always," Josephine said. "I only started saying it recently because recent events have proved me right." Clara laughed. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that fully, without calculating anything, without the part of her brain that was always watching the ledger interrupting to remind her of what was still owed. Nothing was owed, the note was paid, the land was clear. The silver in the ridge was being responsibly extracted by a licensed operation whose agreement specifically protected everything below the tree line. And the income from that agreement had rebuilt the barn and repaired every fence post on the property and purchased 4 new horses and was now sitting in a bank account at an institution that had no connection whatsoever to anyone named Briggs or Marsh or any combination thereof. She found Elias at the fence line after the guests had gone. He was exactly where she'd known he would be, not because he was avoiding the celebration, but because he was a man who existed most naturally in the middle of work. And standing around in a yard with glasses in their hands was not the kind of thing his hands knew how to do for very long. He was checking the last section of the east fence line. Running it with his hand the way he did, feeling for the give and the tension, reading it the way she had seen him read every structure on this property for the past year. She came up beside him. "Everything sound?" she said. "Everything sound," he said. She looked at the fence line. Nodded. "True, not a post out of level." She looked at the ridge, the way she often did it, was part of her thinking landscape now. The way James had always said, the mountains were part of how you thought out here, how you oriented yourself when everything else was uncertain. "Elias," she said. Why did you stay?" she asked. "The first time. After the 60 days were over and the debt was gone and you could have ridden anywhere." He stopped moving his hand along the fence rail. He turned and looked at her the way he had looked at her on the auction platform that first morning, directly, fully, without looking past or through. Because for the first time in 12 years, he said, I was somewhere that felt like I was supposed to be there. She held his gaze, and because, he said, quieter, you looked at me like I was a person. In that square. You looked at me like I was a person, and he stopped. Breathed. I had forgotten what that felt like. She reached out and put her hand over his on the fence rail. He turned his hand over and held hers. The summer stretched out around him, the full, rich, unhurried summer of a place that had been fought for and won. The horses in the pasture, and the fields coming green, and the mountains, standing over everything, the way they had stood over everything for 1,000 years before either of them existed and would stand long after. You are supposed to be here, she said. This is where you're supposed to be. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He lifted her hand and held it for a moment against his chest, where she could feel the steady, unhurried beat of a heart that had been a long time finding its way home. Stood at the fence line of the Whitmore ranch, the Hawthorne ranch now, both names on the deed, the way they had both agreed it should be, without argument, without negotiation. Because it was simply the right thing, and they both recognized right things when they saw them. The mountain above them held its silver in the dark of the rock, patient as it had always been. Summer ran warm and long and clear in every direction. And the woman who had spent her last $3 on the most feared man in Black Pine County, and the man who had spent 12 years on a mountain, believing there was nothing left worth coming down. For they stood together in the afternoon sun, and they were home. Not because the land said so, not because the deed said so. Not because the court had said so or the county had said so, or any of the people who had laughed in that auction square and were not laughing now. Because they had chosen it, every single day. They had looked at each other and chosen it again. And that daily, deliberate, clear-eyed choosing was the only kind of home that ever truly held.